Are shutdowns actually avoidance behavior? In other words, the individual is simply trying to get out of doing something uncomfortable. And how is it different than a meltdown? I'm not sure exactly where to draw the line between intentional and involuntary acts with my ASD husband. Well, when it comes to dealing with a person with ASD level 1 or high-functioning autism, there aren't too many differences between meltdowns and shutdowns. Both are extreme reactions to relationship difficulties and other unwanted stimuli. Both tend to be the result of long-term unresolved issues rather than the more obvious triggers, and both are almost completely out of control for the person rather than being used as a means to an end, which would either be a tantrum or emotional blackmail. Now, some people on the autism spectrum are more prone to meltdowns, while others lean more towards the shutdown reaction. And it's possible to do both, but this depends greatly on the root cause of the problem. Now, there's a personality component to the reaction, with people on the spectrum who are more sure of themselves or more fiercely independent, leaning towards meltdowns rather than shutdowns. But again, there's a wide variance depending on the feelings brought on by the trigger. Some events can make even the most confident person on the spectrum doubt himself. So while a meltdown can be described as rage against a situation, a shutdown tends to be more of a retreat. One prominent behavior that manifests during a shutdown is when the autistic spouse avoids conversation, keeps his distance from his neurotypical spouse, and he engages in his special interest for a lengthy period of time to decompress. Now, as with meltdowns, in a shutdown situation, the person may act irrationally or even in some cases dangerously. Unlike a meltdown, however, the harmful activities are almost always directed at oneself. In worst case scenarios, there could be some self-harm, and in the vast minority of cases, there are reported cases of suicide. As with meltdowns, the cause of a shutdown tends to be cumulative, and the trigger may bear little resemblance to the actual problem. The real problems associated with the shutdowns tend to lean towards depression, loneliness, poor self-image, and poor self-worth. Shutdowns can result from extreme events, for example, losing a job or a marriage breakup and so on, but they can also have very small triggers, which simply remind the person of a larger pain. For example, a small incident at work can provoke some long-term insecurities and cause a retreat. A shutdown will move some form of emotional pain to the center of the person's focus, and he may start contemplating what if and if only scenarios. Now, these thoughts are always counterproductive because you can't change the past, and they usually only make the person feel trapped by events. During a shutdown, the individual will want to retreat for lengthy periods of time and will generally not want to have contact with anyone. So you could think of meltdowns as a short-circuiting of the brain where he is no longer in cognitive control of his responses. And you could think of a shutdown as simply trying to avoid a meltdown. In other words, he hibernates before he's so overwhelmed that his brain shuts down. Are shutdowns actually avoidance behavior? In other words, the individual is simply trying to get out of doing something uncomfortable. And how is it different than a meltdown? I'm not sure exactly where to draw the line between intentional and involuntary acts with my ASD husband. Well, when it comes to dealing with a person with ASD level 1 or high-functioning autism, there aren't too many differences between meltdowns and shutdowns. Both are extreme reactions to relationship difficulties and other unwanted stimuli. Both tend to be the result of long-term unresolved issues rather than the more obvious triggers, and both are almost completely out of control for the person rather than being used as a means to an end, which would either be a tantrum or emotional blackmail. Now, some people on the autism spectrum are more prone to meltdowns, while others lean more towards the shutdown reaction. And it's possible to do both, but this depends greatly on the root cause of the problem. Now, there's a personality component to the reaction, with people on the spectrum who are more sure of themselves or more fiercely independent, leaning towards meltdowns rather than shutdowns. But again, there's a wide variance depending on the feelings brought on by the trigger. Some events can make even the most confident person on the spectrum doubt himself. So while a meltdown can be described as rage against a situation, a shutdown tends to be more of a retreat. One prominent behavior that manifests during a shutdown is when the autistic spouse avoids conversation, keeps his distance from his neurotypical spouse, and he engages in his special interest for a lengthy period of time to decompress. Now, as with meltdowns, in a shutdown situation, the person may act irrationally or even in some cases dangerously. Unlike a meltdown, however, the harmful activities are almost always directed at oneself. In worst case scenarios, there could be some self-harm, and in the vast minority of cases, there are reported cases of suicide. As with meltdowns, the cause of a shutdown tends to be cumulative, and the trigger may bear little resemblance to the actual problem. The real problems associated with the shutdowns tend to lean towards depression, loneliness, poor self-image, and poor self-worth. Shutdowns can result from extreme events, for example, losing a job or a marriage breakup and so on, but they can also have very small triggers, which simply remind the person of a larger pain. For example, a small incident at work can provoke some long-term insecurities and cause a retreat. A shutdown will move some form of emotional pain to the center of the person's focus, and he may start contemplating what if and if only scenarios. Now, these thoughts are always counterproductive because you can't change the past, and they usually only make the person feel trapped by events. During a shutdown, the individual will want to retreat for lengthy periods of time and will generally not want to have contact with anyone. So you could think of meltdowns as a short-circuiting of the brain where he is no longer in cognitive control of his responses. And you could think of a shutdown as simply trying to avoid a meltdown. In other words, he hibernates before he's so overwhelmed that his brain shuts down. When we're angry, we're acting out our fears. Now, while anger is often a reactive emotion, it frequently conceals deeper fears beneath the surface. When people perceive threats, whether they're physical, emotional, or situational, the immediate reaction may not be fear itself, but rather an intensified response of anger. And this instinctual reaction can stem from various sources of fear, and I'm going to look at the big three: fear of vulnerability, fear of loss, and fear of change. Now let's look at each of these in turn. One of the most common fears that drive anger is the fear of being vulnerable. For example, consider a scenario where someone receives constructive criticism about their work, and instead of recognizing the feedback as an opportunity for growth, he reacts defensively with anger, feeling exposed and judged. And this response often stems from a desire to protect oneself from perceived inadequacies. Rather than openly discussing feelings of hurt or embarrassment, the person turns their fear into indignation, leading to conflict instead of constructive dialogue. Now let's look at fear of loss. The fear of losing something valuable, whether it's a relationship, job security, or personal integrity, also can provoke anger. Let's use an example of a spouse who senses their partner growing distant, and maybe she wonders about the possibility of infidelity. This insecurity and fear of losing intimacy can trigger an angry outburst where accusations fly, which overshadow the genuine need to discuss feelings of distance and anxiety. And in such situations, anger acts as a shield against the real emotions of loss or fear of abandonment. And let's look at fear of change. Change is often perceived as a source of anxiety, inviting uncertainty into our lives, whether it's starting a new job, moving to a different city, or experiencing transitions in personal relationships. These changes can and often do evoke a sense of fear about the unknown. For example, a person might find themselves snapping at friends when they receive unexpected news about a job relocation, responding not just to the news itself, but to the feelings of uncertainty and loss of control that accompany it. So here, anger serves as a defense mechanism against the discomfort of facing change directly. Now, the relationship between fear and anger can create a self-perpetuating cycle where the person reacts to his or her fears with anger, and when they do, it often leads to further estrangement from those around them, resulting in increased loneliness and insecurity. And this isolation can provoke even stronger feelings of fear, promoting amplified expressions of anger. So anger, while a natural part of our human experience, it often masks deeper fears that drive our responses. So it's important to recognize these underlying fears as the first step toward addressing anger more constructively. So when we confront our vulnerabilities and fears head on, we not only foster personal growth, but we also enhance the quality of our relationships with others. Once you've been triggered, you have to then resort to intervention, which is 24 times out of 25 a fail. Intervention, that bullet's already left the gun. And the chances of you grabbing it before it gets more than 10 feet away and putting it back in the barrel is almost impossible. So we have to think in terms of prevention. How do we prevent? I get real good at knowing my triggers, and I make sure she knows what they are, so I never get to the shutdown. That's the whole point of this. We want to prevent even getting there. But once you're there, there's multiple things you could do once you're there. All of these are going to be very watered down strategies at this point once you've already crossed the line. But if you've already launched into a shutdown and you've caught it early, the best thing you can do, twofold: breathe with long exhale. Best version would be like a 3-second inhale and a good 7-8 second exhale. Do that for about 10 times. But right prior to that breathing, you tell her, this is not me. Technically, it is shutting down, but you're kind of trying to avoid it. You're going to reframe it as a timeout. You can say to her, before this conversation even gets rolling, I'm already feeling triggered right now, and I want you to let you know I'm going to take a timeout and just do some deep breathing. This is not a shutdown. I'm not in a good state of mind to handle this conversation right now. I'm not sweeping it under the rug. We will tackle this issue. Right now, I got to go breathe. I could stay in and we could have another shit show. Don't throw that last part in. Just do the first part. That particular method that I just mentioned gets a D- on a report card. The A+ method is to do what you got to do such that you never get to the meltdown or shutdown. Because, and I'm not faulting you guys, this is going to sound very sarcastic, you suck at middle meltdown alleviation. When you're already in a meltdown, your track record for being able to back out of that is probably 0%. Am I right? Once you're majorly triggered such that you are now in a meltdown, have you been ever able to unplug it and calm down quick enough? No, you have not. You could think of assertiveness, guys, as a balance between trying to get her needs met and protecting yourself. It's that balance. Before, a lot of guys on the spectrum have totally been in the business of protecting themselves. In other words, if things get a little hairy, they take a meltdown or a shutdown. So now I'm going to try to hang in there and actually listen to what she has to say and actually try to resolve this stuff, but I'm not going to be her whipping post. And she's not going to know when she crosses the line with me, and so I'm going to have to tell her point blank that this crosses up the line with me, and I'm not going to tolerate it. That's not being aggressive. That's not shutting down. That's not doing anything other than letting her know, I want to hear what you say, but I may have to take a time out. I may have to have these discussions at a different time of day. And I'm doing it for your benefit because I want to hear your message. And I'm going to save you from your old pattern of message delivery that influences me to not want to hear it. So one of the things you could do for me, it would be helpful if you have something that's pressing that you need to discuss with me. I'm willing to listen to one problem at a time earlier in the day, as long as we can keep the discussion fairly short. And if it goes on too long, I may have to take a time out. We may have to pick it up later. But I'm doing this for your benefit because I want to get your message. But the only way I'm going to get your message is if I keep my anxiety at bay so that I can think straight. A shutdown and a meltdown, a true shutdown and a meltdown is literally short circuitry in the brain. It's literally where the brain is overloaded to the point where it can't make an educated decision about what to say or do. A true shutdown, a true meltdown is out of your control, which then begs the question, well, what do we do then if he can't control it? You can't think in terms of intervention when we're talking meltdowns and shutdowns. Once it's already got up some steam, it's too late to do anything. It's just going to have to write itself out. So, okay, what do we do then? We have to think in terms, here's the magic word, prevention. Once a train gets going 70, 80 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden somebody wants to stop the train within 100 feet, forget it. Same thing with a meltdown or a shutdown. If you want to stop that shutdown or meltdown train when it's already going full steam, forget it. It's just going to have to write itself out, and eventually it will slow down and stop. It would be good for you to begin to identify your shutdown and meltdown triggers. You could journal that, and it would have to be after the fact. You have a shutdown, and then you could go, okay, well, what happened right before the shutdown? What was my self-talk during the shutdown? What was I feeling during the shutdown? What was my behavior during the shutdown? And you kind of do a little analysis on the antecedent. In other words, what happened before, what happened during, what happened after, with the hope of finding some patterns or themes of your triggers, so that when in your case, shutdown trigger shows up, you go, wait a minute. This thing usually causes me to shut down, and if I don't stop it now, I'm going to be forced to think in terms of intervention. By then it's too late. I've got to prevent this from happening. Some things are unpreventable. I understand that. But the other 80% of things, if you will do a self-investigation on your shutdown triggers, and there's not going to be like 50 of them. There's probably going to be less than five probably max. You don't shut down over 25 different things. When you do an analysis, you'll realize it's probably just 2 or 3 things. And so now you're thinking in terms of prevention. You catch the train before it even gets on the track. What happened before the incident? What was my self-talk? The trick, because it's not the incident that caused your shutdown, it's your self-talk, your internal analysis on the event that causes the shutdown. We could use test anxiety as an example. Let's say that you have test anxiety, you know you got a test coming up tomorrow. That test is not creating your anxiety. It's just a piece of paper. It's your thoughts about the test. Oh, if I don't pass that test, I may not pass the class. And if I don't pass the class, I may have to take it over. And if I have to take it over, I'm not going to graduate as fast. If I don't graduate as fast, it's going to cost me more money. You're off and running by then. So you want to look at not only the antecedent, but your self-talk about the antecedent. The event happened. I had self-talk based on the event. I had certain feelings based on my self-talk. I had certain behavior based on my feelings. And the result occurred after all of that business. And so that's the analysis right there. And it would be helpful to write it down. Here's the nutshell about him. 2 big things. High anxiety, although in many cases he will say, no, I don't feel particularly anxious. Well, if he has emotions blindness, he wouldn't know. And if he's been anxious from childhood, he doesn't have anything to contrast it with. So when I hear the NT wife say, or even he says, no, I don't particularly feel anxious. Okay, well, do you shut down? Yeah. Do you have meltdowns? Yeah. Okay, well, that tells me you have anxiety, because shutdowns and meltdowns are all about anxiety reduction. But once a shutdown or a meltdown has started, that bullet has left the gun. And so intervening in that moment, and you have tried to intervene in the middle of a shutdown or a meltdown, I can promise you every time you made it worse. Intervention, once that bullet has left the gun, it only makes a bad problem worse. It's not even a neutral thing. Definitely doesn't help the problem. So we have to think in terms of prevention. And one of the things that you can do, and I'm just going to call this because anxiety is at the root. And nothing raises his anxiety more than risky conversations about marital issues or other things that he's going to download as threatening. So we'll just call this the anxiety scale for risky conversations. And you would want to run this past him before you ever implement it. And if he's open to watching these videos, he can watch this video and you can hear it from me. So this scale is going to range from 1 to 5, 1 being very low anxiety and 5 being very high. And you're going to, with his permission, after you've approached him about this and say, can we use this scale thing so we can think in terms of prevention. So you're going to use the scale when you're talking to him about the important stuff or the stuff that you feel like you might be at risk for him doing some version of meltdown or shutdown. So if they're even remotely potentially stressful topics, I would say, okay, before we go into this conversation, can we use this anxiety scale for risky conversations? Okay, I guess. So as you're delivering your message that's obviously important to you, otherwise you wouldn't be bringing it up, you're going to be checking in with him periodically, or he can clue you periodically where he's at on the scale. So I'll make up a minute length of time. Let's say the message, this conversation is going to take 15 minutes. I wouldn't go more than 3 minutes without a check-in. I'm just making these numbers up. You can plug in your own numbers. I would never, ever have a risky conversation that went over 20 or 30 minutes. But you're really on thin ice there. But let's be liberal and say 15. Although some NT-wise, well, it's not very liberal. But time is not on your side. So let's say for sake of discussion, it's a 15-minute conversation. And I would check in with him about every 3 minutes or so and say, okay, so far so good? Yeah, I think so. That's all you have to say, or say whatever you want, but just do some form of a check-in. Now, if he hits level 3, and I know this is not an exact science, but he probably would know when he's getting agitated and upset with you. And if he doesn't know, because he's alexithymic, you know what kind of facial cues, body language, his voice is getting louder, he seems to be, when he's getting agitated. And so he can bring it up. Yeah, I feel what you said right there. I'm not trying to start a fight or anything, but I've hit a 3 with that comment. Okay, so that's when you know you're going to take a timeout. Not a shutdown where he never wants to discuss the thing again. You've given him permission to take a timeout. But you may catch it before he catches it, and you may go, okay, you know what? Do you feel like you're at level 3? He might even say, no, I don't really feel like it. But his words and his behavior don't match. And you kind of have a gut instinct that he's getting agitated, I can already tell. So when he says he's at a 3, or when you guesstimate that he's at a 3, just know that at that point, you're wasting your time and you're at risk for him doing a shutdown or meltdown. You're wasting your time because if he hits a level 3, he will have great difficulty listening to what you're saying, understanding what he hears, retaining what he understands, and following through with what he's retaining. So you're really losing the battle quickly. Slippery slope when he hits a 3. And as I said, you're at a risk of experiencing some version of meltdown or shutdown or false agreement, which is, yeah, honey, yeah, sure, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, you're right. And then you check up with him the next day or whatever, and it's like, sometimes he didn't even remember the conversation, or he certainly doesn't follow through with what he said. He was just agreeing with you to hurry up and get the conversation over with so he could go back to baseline with his anxiety level. So at level 3, it's going to be best to simply call a timeout until he comes back to level 1. And I'm assuming that he's participating, that you have previewed this whole method with him. So the deal is when you get to level 1, get your calm down and whatever, we'll try it again. And in that case, you would just continue the discussion again. And there's no limit, unless it's something emergent where there needs to be a decision made quickly. But the other 95% of the time, it could be numerous timeouts. I don't mean 30, but if you have to have 3 or 4 timeouts to get the total message delivery, that's perfectly fine. So when he gets back down to level 1, you continue the discussion, and this is going to help prevent. That's the whole point of this message. prevent meltdowns and shutdowns. A common theme does exist among people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism, specifically their tendency to exhibit both behavioral and cognitive rigidity, which spouses often perceive as stubbornness and being insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and numerous other adjectives. But the behavioral and cognitive rigidity that gets perceived as just rude behavior is definitely a response to anxiety. There's a strong correlation between anxiety and inflexibility, and that can be evident at home, and it also can be evident in the workplace. So a vulnerability to anxiety is definitely an intrinsic feature of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, and that's due to three different things, really. It's due to a specific neurotransmitter system defect. It's also due to a breakdown in circuitry related to extinguishing fear responses. And it's also a secondary consequence of the individual's inability to make appropriate social judgments. So there's numerous factors at play that increase anxiety in people on the autism spectrum. I could spend the next hour talking about that, but I'll try to keep this answer fairly short. A lack of empathy significantly limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. For example, the individual is unaware in many cases that he has said hurtful things or behaved in inappropriate ways. And this results in him, we'll use the example of an NT wife and the husband with autism. This behavior that he exhibits often gets him in trouble with his wife. I work with men on the autism spectrum a lot, and it seems like they all say, yeah, they're in the doghouse, and they feel like they're always in trouble. So this all relates to a lack of empathy, or we will call it a lack of displayed empathy. They have empathy, they just don't necessarily display it. And this limits skills for autonomous social problem solving. Social problem solving, that's an important term to remember. Limitations in generalizing from one situation to another often contribute to in this case, the autistic husband repeating the same social mistakes over and over again. If he gets into a heated argument with his NT wife over a specific problem, and she conveys to him what he needs to do differently next time, he will get it with that specific problem. But if there's a second problem that's just slightly different, he may not necessarily be able to generalize from the first problem to the second problem. Also, another factor that is at play that increases anxiety is the individual's inability to grasp social cues, facial expressions, body language, and so on. So this creates a lot of repeated social errors because he's misinterpreting what is being expressed to him. Social limitations also make it difficult for him to develop coping strategies to soothe himself and to contain difficult emotions. And so those are just a few. There's many more. The circumstances that raise the anxiety level for people on the autism spectrum often result in their increased need to control people, places, and things. This need for control takes the form of rigidity, which is what you were referring to in your question as stubbornness. So there's behavioral rigidity and cognitive rigidity. Behavioral rigidity refers to the person's difficulty in maintaining appropriate behavior in new and unfamiliar situations. Okay? And then there's cognitive rigidity, and this occurs when the individual is unable to consider alternatives to the current situation, alternative viewpoints, or innovative solutions to a problem. People with rigid thinking do tend to view situations in either or terms. It's either right or wrong, good, bad, black, white. They want concrete black and white answers, and the gray areas of life are often very uncomfortable for people with behavioral and cognitive rigidity. Symptoms of rigidity often introduce some of the most disruptive chronic behaviors exhibited by people on the autism spectrum. For example, aggression, difficulties tolerating changes in routine, dislike of changes to plans that have been previously laid out. You may have experienced with your partner on the spectrum his or her meltdowns, frustration, shutdowns, and problems with minor differences in the environment. I get a lot of feedback from NT wives that say they feel that they're always walking on eggshells in an effort to circumvent any extreme reaction from their very brittle Asperger's husband. In addition, the husband himself may articulate his anxiety over fears that things will not go according to plan, or that he'll be forced to make changes that he can't handle. Sometimes these behaviors are identified as obsessive compulsive because of the husband's need for ritualized order or non-functional routine. In other words, he has a strong need for sameness. So, as one can easily imagine, behavioral and cognitive rigidity causes many problems in relationships, which usually result in a higher level of anxiety for the person on the autism spectrum. Therefore, this cycle just continues at that point. Since my social intelligence and emotional intelligence is low, I have a hard time reading body language, facial cues, tone of voice, volume of voice, filling in between the lines when somebody's somewhat vague. Since I have this mind blindness issue where I'm not really sure what people's motives are, I'm not really sure what's going on inside of their thinking process, I'm not really sure what they're feeling in their heart, I'm not really sure what they're planning. I have a hard time predicting outcomes based on this misinformation that I'm getting because I have this mind blindness thing. So what ends up happening is I'm always in a state of confusion because I never really totally know what the hell's going on. And I'm like dodging paintballs all day. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what is this person thinking, or what are they feeling? Is it my fault? Is it something else? And there's this guesswork that goes on all goddamn day long. And so since you're in a constant state of confusion and guesswork, as you well can imagine, causes a lot of anxiety. Because I never know what the hell's going on. I'm always trying to guess what's going on. So I am literally in a heightened state of anxiety to one degree or another. I'm never not anxious unless I'm engaging in my special interest. But for the most part, I'm in some form of anxiety all day long. What do I do when I'm anxious 24/7? I probably even have anxious dreams. So what do I do in that case? I engage in anxiety reduction. Since I'm anxious all the time, I do as many things as I know how to reduce my anxiety. But I have found in many cases the individual's anxiety reduction techniques at the very best only work temporarily, and in many cases not even temporarily. But in most cases, the anxiety reduction techniques, which would be anger, rage, shutdowns, meltdowns, whatever, I mean, the list is long. Their anxiety reduction technique actually increases the anxiety. I often get a lot of neurotypical spouses wanting to inquire about why their partner with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism has meltdowns. And I got an email recently, and I get a lot of these, and in essence, this is a neurotypical wife, and she's wanting to understand more fully why her Asperger's husband has meltdowns. Before we can address that, we'll have to look at anxiety, because a meltdown or a shutdown is a result of high anxiety. And so you could think of a meltdown as simply a symptom of anxiety. If your husband, for example, who has Asperger's syndrome, goes into a meltdown or a shutdown, you can bet that what preceded that was something that raised his anxiety. We'll just call this the anxiety cycle, and a meltdown will be part of this cycle. So unfortunately, it's very common for people with Asperger's to experience more than their fair share of stress. And honestly, to make matters worse, many of these people lack the ability to manage their stress effectively. They've come up with some coping mechanisms to deal with it, and unfortunately, many of these mechanisms are dysfunctional. In other words, they kind of make a bad problem worse, or they solve the problem temporarily only. So individuals with Asperger's are particularly prone to anxiety disorders as a consequence of the social demands made on them. Any social contact can generate anxiety as to how to start, maintain, and end the activity or conversation. Changes to daily routine can exacerbate the anxiety, and also certain sensory sensitivities can also contribute to that. Many of my clients have reported feeling anxious for no apparent reason at all. They were fine the previous day, they wake up, they get started with their day, and for some reason they're anxious, and they can't pinpoint it. They can't attribute it to any particular event or something that somebody said or did. So not only do people with Asperger's and high-functioning autism experience anxiety, oftentimes it's random and for no apparent reason. Perhaps some of these individuals take life too seriously. Perhaps they take others' behavior and comments too personally. And perhaps they just generally view themselves as worrywarts, and so they've kind of labeled themselves that way. And so chronically worrying that something bad will happen or something good won't happen has honestly just become a habit. And that's an important concept. Once you have anxiety for a period of time, it actually becomes a habit, and it operates at an unconscious level. So that's the first thing that happens in this business that relates to a meltdown, is the anxiety piece. What follows then is the need for anxiety reduction, of course. Nobody can go through day after day, 365 days a week under high anxiety without having some kind of problem or searching for some kind of remedy. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, unfortunately, in many cases, their anxiety reduction techniques actually create more problems, or further their anxiety, or drive people away, or can result in school suspension, job loss, divorce, and so on. So they do try to manage their anxiety in healthful ways. They think for example, distracting themselves by engaging in their special interest for excessive amounts of time. Some people turn to marijuana, some people turn to alcohol, various things, and some work to some degree, some don't work at all, and some only work temporarily. But the two main things that they do for anxiety reduction would be, of course, the shutdown, and that is where they just hibernate. They just want to be by themselves, and they withdraw, don't want to talk to anybody. They just want to temporarily take a time out and escape from the world. And then the other thing they do, the opposite end of the spectrum of a shutdown, would be the meltdown, and that's what we're trying to address today. So as this anxiety, whatever its cause, builds up and builds up, eventually the dam breaks, so to speak, usually over something very small. It's literally the straw that breaks the camel's back. Under severe enough stress, any normally calm and collected person with Asperger's may become totally out of control and have a huge explosion. And that's usually what people see when they see somebody having a meltdown. So those who experience meltdowns are often perceived by others as always being angry. I hear from neurotypical spouses all the time that their Asperger's husband only shows anger. When he's sad, it shows up as anger. If he's mad, it shows up as anger. If he's depressed, all he displays is anger. Even though they do have several emotions underneath there, they only show the surface emotion, which is anger. Rage may be a common reaction experienced when coming to terms with problems in employment, relationships, friendships, and other areas in life affected by Asperger's. There is often this on-off quality
to the person's rage, where the person may be calm minutes later after a meltdown, while the people around are stunned and shocked that what they just witnessed. And so in this case, the Asperger's man is, after he's had his meltdown, 5 minutes later he's fine, and everybody else is still going, what the hell happened, and they're still in a state of shock. Neurotypical spouses often struggle to understand these meltdowns, with resentment and bitterness often building up over time. In some cases, the Asperger's individual may not even acknowledge he has trouble with rage, and he will blame others for provoking him. And as you can well imagine, this creates a lot of conflict in the marriage. There would literally be hundreds of examples of how meltdowns can play out, but for the sake of this video here, we're going to just discuss the following example, and we'll apply this example throughout. So, let's say the Asperger's individual's had a rough day at work, but he was able to kind of maintain his composure for the most part through the day. But when he gets home, his wife makes a comment that she didn't think was particularly provoking or upsetting, but that hits the man wrong for some reason, and he explodes. So in other words, he kind of takes out his anxiety that he experienced through the day. He takes that out on his wife, unintentionally, of course. I mean, it wasn't premeditated. He didn't think on the way home, I'm going to give my wife hell when I walk in the door. But he was already in a position where he was about to explode, and it didn't take much more steam to blow the lid off of that kettle. So the next phase in this anxiety cycle is guilt. And we're going to use the example of the guy coming home from work, okay? So if this particular scenario plays itself out numerous times over months and years, in other words, it seems to be a theme or a pattern that he always comes home in a bad mood and to one degree or another takes it out on his wife, the Asperger's husband in this case will come to believe that he's the victim of his emotions. In this case, work-related stress expressed in the form of misplaced anger toward his wife. But not only does he feel like a victim of circumstances, he also feels an element of guilt and remorse for hurting the people that he loves. He may have tried numerous times to avoid repeating this scenario, where he comes home and he knows he's taking out his anger on his wife when really it should have been directed at the coworker that pissed him off earlier in the day. But even though he tries to avoid the meltdown, he still has this work-related stress that's unresolved, and he hasn't figured out a way to deal with this stress in a functional, non-destructive way. So since he keeps repeating this same cycle that he doesn't want to repeat, he's beginning to feel very guilty about the whole damn thing. So what do you do when you have ongoing toxic guilt? Well, what happens next in this cycle is self-punishment. As a result of repeated social failures, in other words, in this case, numerous negative encounters with his wife, the person with Asperger's may come to the conclusion that he doesn't deserve love, he doesn't deserve compassion, he doesn't deserve to have a peaceful lifestyle. Therefore, he may do destructive things to punish himself. For example, beating up on himself with negative self-talk, drinking or drug use, overeating, isolation, and possibly even separation or divorce. In other words, he's the one that initiates separation or divorce because he thinks that he deserves that. Guilt is supposed to be a pro-social emotion. In other words, it functions to preserve important relationships. But many people with Asperger's who experience repeated exposures to this anxiety cycle that we're talking about here have unresolved guilt, which literally prevents them from enjoying life and thriving emotionally. Instead, they're just trying to survive life, and they're just trying to survive emotionally. So the whole thing started off with anxiety. He tried to reduce his anxiety, in this case with numerous dysfunctional methods that didn't work. And so since he couldn't come up with an anxiety reduction method that worked, he went to the default meltdown. In other words, the anxiety built up so much that he couldn't even engage in any kind of hopeful interventions at that point. It was just explosion time. Then he feels guilty for these explosions. Then he punishes himself for these explosions, and we've gone full circle right back to anxiety again, because all of these different steps in the cycle are hugely stressful. So months or even years of experiencing numerous negative emotions, stress, frustration, anger, rage, guilt, and so on, obviously can make relationships so problematic that the better option becomes living alone or avoiding human contact as much as possible. In many cases, the man gets divorced and he just decides, I'm never getting married again. I'm never going to try this love thing again. I suck at it and I hurt people and I'm just better off left to my own company. But unfortunately, all of us are social creatures by nature. As human beings, we need other people. Therefore, living a life of solitude carries its own element of anxiety because people need other people. And so when he chooses a solitary lifestyle, he's by default chosen to make his anxiety even worse.
Hey guys, this is Mark. Click on the join button underneath any of my videos, then click on members only videos, and then click on join. And for $9.99 a month, you'll have access to members only videos, which are excerpts from previous workshops I've conducted for NT partners, ASD partners, and the neurodiverse couple. New videos will be uploaded weekly. Hey, this is Mark Hutton. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendar link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available. Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.